Stables are one of the best things in professional wrestling, but in order for them to work, they need great members. Without Scott Hall and Kevin Nash leading the charge against WCW and the NWO, the group would have crumbled, and without Ric Flair and Arn Anderson, the Horsemen would have just been ponies. And without Heath Slater and the three-man band, well, they would have just been a bunch of jobbers. But in nearly every stable, there's someone who doesn't quite belong. They don't fit the vibe of the group, and they just bring everyone else down a bit. It might not even be their fault because they probably just shouldn't have been added in the first place. Even the greatest stables have had one or two of these members, and well, the NWO, they had like 45. Well, I'm Andrew with WhatCulture, and here are the weakest members of 10 popular stables. Number 10, Steve McMichael in the Four Horsemen. When people think of the weakest horseman ever, Paul Roma immediately comes to mind. It's widely believed his involvement was a complete disaster and that he nearly killed the group and WCW and possibly the entire wrestling business. But my counter is simply, yeah, but Steve McMichael. Roma was a good worker and he was decent on promos, and he wasn't in the group all that long anyway to create any lasting damage. McMichael, though, was the equivalent of your once-in-shape uncle going through wrestling camp for a month and then skipping half those days. He was clunky, he was slow, and he was very green, and oh yeah, he was also one of the worst color commentators of all time. Mongo had the hot wife in Deborah, and he had the NFL background, but this was the guy who was most well known in wrestling at that point for carrying around a tiny dog. Roma 1, Mongo 0. Number 9, Samoa Joe in the Main Event Mafia. How can Joe be the weakest member of any stable? Well, it's because he was in one that he had no business being in. The Main Event Mafia consisted of a group of former world champions from WCW and WWE, all banding together to teach that younger generation some respect. Sting, Kurt Angle, Scott Steiner, Kevin Nash, and Booker T as a unit were pretty entertaining. Then Joe joined them, and it really made no sense. Yes, Jenna Maraska and Tracy Brooks were technically members of the group as well, but they weren't around long. Joe, though, messed up the entire concept. He should have been leading the charge against the former main eventers, but he willingly gave up the title, like the finger poke of doom, to let Kurt Angle win it instead because that was a swerve, bro. The biggest insult of all, though, was that Joe didn't even bother wearing a suit like the rest of them. Number 8, Braun Strowman in the Wyatt family. Initially, the Wyatt family was one of the most exciting acts to come along in years in WWE, but unfortunately, WWE ruins everything good, so yeah. When Eric Rowan went down with an injury, they needed another member in the group, so Braun Strowman was called up to be the modern-day Mason Ryan. He was initially pushed as unstoppable, and he easily beat up Dean Ambrose and Roman Reigns all by himself. But then management realized he couldn't do complicated wrestling moves, like punching and running the ropes. Strowman was really just bad in the ring, and while Rowan wasn't exactly Ricky Steamboat, the man replacing him seemed like he should have been in developmental for another year, or maybe 2 years, or maybe 15 years. And really, what kind of scary hillbilly has a Superman tattoo anyway? Number 7, Terry Reynolds in the Radicals. Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, Perry Saturn, and Terry Reynolds? Yeah, that was actually a thing that happened for a bit, but to be fair, the alliance didn't last that long in that form, as it was near the sad, bitter end of the once promising group. Benoit became a singles act, Guerrero went to rehab, and that just left Saturn and Malenko to carry on the Radicals' name. So Terry just joined them, and then a mop did too, and sadly, that mop was actually more over than her. Number 6, Rodney and Pete Gas in the Corporate Ministry. The Mean Street Posse was kind of fun at first, but then they overstayed their welcome. The two real-life friends of Shane McMahon, they didn't have any wrestling training, yet they were given a decent-sized role on TV that others would have killed for. They encouraged their son-of-a-billionaire buddy on to victory at WrestleMania 15 against X-Pac, and that probably should have been it. But it was only the beginning of this awful nightmare, because when Shane and the corporation merged with the Ministry of Darkness, they just tagged along. So The Undertaker, Bradshaw, Farouk, Triple H, Chyna, Viscera, and Rodney and Pete Gas. Cool. Number 5, Ron and Don Harris in the NWO. Where do you even begin to come up with the weakest NWO member? Because half the company was in the group at one point. Do you go with Horace Hogan, who had the charisma of a recycling bin? Or what about WWF castoffs like Michael Wall Street or Big Bubba? How about David Flair, who made Horace Hogan look like Ric Flair? There are a lot of really good choices, but I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to go with Ron and Don Harris. 2 guys. Jeff Jarrett, Bret Hart, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and Scott Steiner all joined forces in late 1999 to reform the New World Order, this time with black and silver. However, one by one, everyone became injured or left the group except for Jarrett and his 2 henchmen, Ronald and Donald, who somehow snuck in and stuck around. So in 1996, it was Hogan, Hall, and Nash dominating the wrestling world under the banner of the New World Order. 4 years later, it was Double J, Skull, and 8 Ball closing the curtain on the group. Number 4, Lex Luger in the WOLFPAC. Luger was one of the most popular wrestlers in America in the early 90s. He was briefly positioned as the next Hulk Hogan in the WWF, except that he was even better because he had his own bus. Lots of people loved him, there's really no doubt about that. But do I believe for one moment that Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, and Conan would hang out with him in their free time? No, not for a second. I'm sorry, I just don't. During the Monday Night Wars, the Wolfpac was cool as a renegade breakoff from the NWO. Now, Macho Man joining the group was a bit odd, but you could still kind of buy into it. Sting was a bit of a stretch as well, because he always worked best as a loner. But Luger, he just didn't work at all. His promos were cringeworthy, his in-ring work was very Lex Luger-ish, and he always had that look on his face that he'd rather be mowing a lawn than wrestling. It's nothing against Lex personally, he just wasn't meant to be a part of the Wolfpac forever. Or really at all. Number 3, Hector Guerrero in L.A.K. When Conan had a falling out with TNA and left the company, somebody needed to come in and take his place as the leader of the badass L.A.K. Management didn't seem to search long for his replacement though, and they walked like 20 feet to the Spanish announce table to ask Hector Guerrero if he was interested, and he was probably like, okay. And then L.A.K., under the guidance of the former gobbledygooker, died an embarrassing death. Number 2, Lance Von Erich in the Von Erichs. Having the Von Erich surname was a ticket to stardom in WCCW, so Fritz, the patriarch of the family, thought it would be okay to just create another one. But instead of getting to work being a genetic jackhammer and making another kid and then waiting 20 years, he just picked up William Vaughn and then changed his name to Lance and then slapped a Von Erich label on the end of it and called it a day. He was the long-lost cousin of the family that nobody knew and nobody wanted. Of course, it just did not go over well. Fans knew he wasn't an actual family member, and they greeted him with the enthusiasm of a Roman Reigns versus Roman Reigns match, if that was physically possible. So Fancy Lancey, not a nickname he was actually given, I just came up with that, only lasted about a year in the role before being politely asked to give the name back, and then having all of his future holiday invitations to the Von Erich's house rescinded. And number 1, ROCCO in the Legion of Doom. The Legion of Doom will always be hawk and animal to wrestling fans. But a few other men and women also came along for the ride. Draws, Heidenreich, Sonny, and Christy Hemme can all lay claim to being part of the legendary stable at one point or another. But there was one member that fans would like to forget, even more so than Heidenreich. At SummerSlam 92, Hawk, Animal, and their manager Paul Ellering blared down the aisles on their motorcycle. It was a really cool visual, except for one tiny thing. A dummy named Rocco attached to Paul's bike. The scariest, most dominant team in all of wrestling in the 80s was stuck with the doll as their mascot. It would be like Scott Steiner hanging out with Chucky. As part of the storyline, that big, dumb, stupid doll was found by the group in a dilapidated house, and a half-assed reasoning was concocted that they wanted to get back to their Chicago roots. Behind the scenes, it was to try and sell some of those stupid, ugly, terrifying dolls. Sadly, Rocco did not last long, as Animal revealed later that he was lost at the airport. Don't go bother looking for him because no one will care. Well, that's all for the list. Got any other weak stable members? Sound off below. I'm Andrew with WhatCulture. You can follow me at Andrew Socek on Twitter, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more great content.